The third responsibility is what we call export promotion or export assistance. And that's basically helping a lot of our small and mid-sized manufacturers around North Carolina to grow their base of customers, especially in overseas markets around the world. We live in the greatest country in the world and the biggest, well, I guess it sort of depends on how you define it, but the biggest economy in the world. But at the end of the day, the United States is still just 5% of the world's population and about 25% of the world's purchasing power. That means if you're a company with goods and services to sell, 95% of the world's population and 75% of the world's purchasing power sits outside the United States. We have a lot of small and mid-sized manufacturers who are interested in expanding their sales network to include Europe, Asia, Canada, Mexico, South America, Africa, the Middle East. Depending on the company, we have a lot of those kinds of companies that have those ambitions. But what they don't have is they don't have a large global sales team or a global distribution network. They're figuring out what's the best way I can start making sales into maybe Mexico or Canada to start, but eventually getting into places like Europe or Asia. And so our team is helping those small and mid-sized businesses figure out whether, where, and how to begin exporting their goods and services. And the reason we do that is if those companies have any kind of success at all in growing their sales to customers outside the United States, there's a good chance all that new sales revenue comes back to that company that's here in North Carolina today, and it allows those companies to continue investing in the growth of their operations here in this state. Again, tie it back to what I originally said about how do you get new money flowing into an economy. If we can help our existing companies be more successful growing their sales overseas, that new money will hopefully find its way back to North Carolina in a way that helps to develop that company in that community. And so here in Haywood County, for example, we've had conversations with, is it Bearwater Brewing Company, I think is one of the local breweries, and then Oaks Unlimited, it's, they make, I think, a kiln-dried lumber. Those are a couple companies that we've assisted in some of our export consultations, trying to help them figure out where and how they can grow their export sales in markets around the world. The fourth function that we're responsible for handling is small business startup counseling. And that's basically a centralized resource. It's a 1-800 number staffed by 4 of our employees around the year. And they field calls primarily from individuals who are looking to start a business here in North Carolina. That could be someone who wants to open up a new bed and breakfast. It could be someone who wants to start a new dog training academy. It could be someone who wants to start a new yoga studio. It doesn't really matter. This is an individual who wants to start a business. Maybe they live here today. Maybe they live somewhere else and they want to retire in North Carolina but also start a new business. We're basically helping those individuals understand what those first few steps are in the process of getting a business up and going in North Carolina. All of you who started your own business, you probably remember there was paperwork, there were permits, there were licenses, there were things you had to make sure you did to be compliant from a tax perspective, a legal perspective, a hiring perspective. That's what those 4 individuals are doing around the clock to those 20,000 individuals who call in every year seeking counseling on how they get that business started in North Carolina. And with any luck, a lot of those individuals will go on to form successful small businesses that can also power economic development in their respective part of North Carolina. The last piece of it, which I think is especially important to where we sit today, is all of the work that goes into promoting North Carolina for tourism. That is also one of the responsibilities we have as an organization, is to attract visitor spending to North Carolina. And again, that's another great example of how new money gets brought into the economy of our state, because we get 52 million visitors a year from outside North Carolina who are visiting everywhere from the mountains to the coast to the golf courses in between. And the great thing about tourists, as your local tourism authority can tell you, they come here, they spend their money. They spend their money on bed and breakfasts, they spend their money at restaurants, gas stations, and other things, and then they go back home to wherever they came from. You don't need the education and transportation, social services to take care of these folks. You simply have to have the attractions and amenities that get them here. They leave their money behind, they inject it into your local economy, and they're off back to wherever they came from. And that's a great way for North Carolina to capitalize on new economic activity flowing into the state. And so when we're out there promoting North Carolina for tourism, our target audience are individuals and families looking at where to spend their vacation. That's a big part of who we cater to. But we also focus on things like film and TV production. That's another great way to get sort of tourism-based dollars into the state. Other questions on what we do or see at a state level? Yes, sir.
Hey, I'm Scott McCott. I'm a member of the local EDC and involved with the chamber.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how successful you've been at getting corporate funding. I know we try to get everything from Help for Breakfast like this,
sure,
golf tournaments, everything. And what percentage of your funding comes from corporate support? And how successful
yeah, great question. Thank you, Scott. So I think about 12% of our total funding comes from the private sector. We are, so when this organization was created a couple years ago, it was created by the state legislature. And there was a requirement put in that we fundraise a certain level of private dollars every year, which is about 1.25 million. And so we have a steady budget of about 19 million a year across those 5 functions. So whatever 1.25 million is of that denominator. So yeah, it's a good portion, but most organizations like this will still continue to be dependent on the public funding. Again, we're essentially spending the same public funding that had been spent when this work was being done within a state agency. It's now that funding is being put towards this nonprofit, and the nonprofit can go out there and add additional private dollars to that. So there's no limit on how much we can raise. North Carolina is a big state, but the kinds of companies we can realistically ask to contribute, they're probably going to be in those categories I talked about: construction companies, utilities, the types of companies that know if we get more companies into North Carolina, they're going to see some indirect benefit through more energy sales or more construction projects that they can bid on. So yeah, we certainly want to raise some private dollars to give us more resources. The one thing we want to do, though, is be cautious that we never jeopardize our local partners' fundraising efforts. And I think that's a pretty easy balance to strike.
I suspect I know, but can you share who like the 3 or 4 biggest projects?
Oh yeah, sure. Duke Energy is a big one.
Right.
Piedmont Natural Gas. Now we'll see. Now that Piedmont's part of Duke, they may be one combined contribution next year. MetLife. They have major operations here in North Carolina. Let's see here. PNC Bank, PSNC Energy, the North Carolina Railroad, Electricities of North Carolina. They represent all the municipal electric providers around the state. Those are probably a lot of our investors that are in that $50,000 and up per year. Yeah, I think we have 75 total investors this past year. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You indicated a great partnership with the community colleges. As you go throughout the state and the skilled workers, the educated workers you need, are you seeing that there is more funding needed for education? And if so, how can you help to get that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on whether you mean more funding for things like K through 12 education or more funding for things like post-secondary. Yeah, I mean, yeah, education, whether you're talking K through 12 or the community colleges or the 4-year universities, those are all essentially all part of the same pipeline to produce the talent that employers in the private sector need. How you get the necessary resources to all those different groups, that's a much bigger policy issue. That's not an easy question to answer. I think it's something every state struggles with, is how do we make sure that we have the workforce that we need? How do we make sure that we pay our teachers sufficiently so they're not tempted to leave the state and go somewhere else? I think, we can play a role in the sense where we're on the front lines, if you will, hearing what it is that private industry is looking for. And if there's a severe deficiency between what they're looking for and what they can find here in North Carolina, then I think our job is to let the policymakers know, hey, this is costing us real deals where we're not able to compete with such and such other states because the perception is we lack this type of skill set or workforce. And I think if we're doing a good job conveying that to the people who control how much funding goes to those different educational providers and how they spend that funding, then hopefully over the long term there would be some impact there in how much better prepared the educational system is in producing the talent that's necessary. But it's not easy. The needs of private industry, they change, I think, at a much more rapid clip than the capability of the educational system to adapt to that. It's sort of like turning a Coast Guard cutter versus turning an aircraft carrier. It takes a longer time to make those changes throughout the education system, whereas industry, those needs can evolve very, very rapidly. So that's been a challenge I've seen throughout 20 years of economic development. There's always a little bit of that gap between what industry needs and what the education system provides. I am encouraged, though, because at no point earlier than this in 20 years, I mean, I've seen much more collaboration between business and academia and education on how to align what the workforce system's producing versus what employers are looking for. There's always still going to be a gap just based on the timing and how needs change, but I think it's a smaller gap than maybe what we saw 10, certainly 20 years ago. Does that answer the question?
I can take your word that that's what you're seeing. I guess the other side of that is we're seeing what's happened to funding of education.
Sure.
So it may be that 10 years from now when we see the results
Right.
of what's happening now, which scares me. If there's a gap now,
Yeah.
if the funding continues to go down, how wide would that gap, could that gap get?
Right, yeah, that's a hard thing to predict. I mean, yeah, education funding is surprisingly as important as we intuitively know it is to make sure, my wife and I don't have kids yet, but at some point we're certainly looking at that. We want to make sure that whatever school our kids go to, that the teachers are paid well enough where they're committed to doing a good job, right? I mean, I think that's what most people would expect of their school system. The challenge is, as important as that is, when, Mark can tell you this too, when we get approached by companies who are interested in looking in North Carolina, very rarely, if ever, have I recalled them asking the question about things like, well, how much is North Carolina spending per pupil on education? Or what are your teacher salaries? They're more often asking things like, what's your cost of electricity? What are your local and state tax rates? What kinds of incentives are available? I think intuitively people get that the K through 12 is especially important, making sure you've got well-prepared adults entering the workforce. But surprisingly, it's not really a question that gets asked specifically by companies. And even more surprisingly, when you look at the states that spend the most per pupil on education, it tends to be a lot of states, for example, in the Northeast US, up in New England. Conversely, when you look at these annual business climate rankings that a CNBC or Forbes publishes, best states to do business, worst states to do business, ironically, a lot of those states that spend the most per pupil on education tend to be some of the worst rated in terms of business climates for these types of publications. And that probably has something to do with the fact that if you're paying your education system a lot, it probably has something to do with how much in tax rates you're also charging individuals and businesses. And those kinds of things, of course, get factored into those business climate scorings. Not saying one approach is right or wrong, but it's sort of this disconnect between what we intuitively understand about the value of a good educational system versus what the business community tends to prioritize in its mind about where they want to go. Texas has some of the lowest spending per pupil in the country, and yet they're oftentimes at the top of some of those business climate rankings. So again, it's always been something that strikes me as very odd. I don't know how to reconcile those two contradictions, but clearly there's a bit of a disconnect there between sort of the value we all place on a good education system versus what industry says it's looking for in terms of a business location. So I didn't answer your question, I know, but it's...
You did, yeah. I guess we just hear it. We don't have the workers, we don't have the educated workers. Well, I agree with you. I think when the industry looks at it, a company they're doing everything. The tax rate,
Sure.
benefits, where it could help you go up or down, forgetting the educational part. So I think that's what you're saying.
I think it gets overlooked unintentionally because there's some other more quantifiable things in the near term that they can look at. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What are your biggest successes since you guys we've been doing it this way?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a number of companies that we've helped recruit or expand. I mean, one of the bigger projects has been in Johnston County. That was the expansion of a large biopharmaceutical manufacturer, Novo Nordisk. They put a $1.6 billion expansion, billion with a B, in a new diabetes medication manufacturing facility. That's going to add 600 people on top of 800 that they already have. And in Johnston County, that's a pretty big deal. Some of you may have seen the news yesterday. Everest Textiles, a Taiwanese textiles company, announced a new location in Forest City. That's 600 new jobs and multiple tens of millions in new investment. A big part of what we're chasing are overseas companies. About a third of the companies we're talking to are not owned by U.S. parent companies. They're European or Asian or elsewhere owned. It's a global economy we live in, and the U.S. continues to be an attractive market for companies around the world to sell into, but at some point, if they begin selling enough, they're going to think very long and hard about putting something here in North Carolina, in the U.S. to produce whatever goods they're selling into the market today. And so I think that textiles company is a good example of how North Carolina can benefit from that continued flow of inbound investment. Yes, ma'am.
With the governor relinquishing, withdrawing his, saying that he has lost, was that changed the outlook on some of the businesses who said they were not going to come to North Carolina because of the HB2 controversy?
It's entirely possible. We haven't heard any companies put it in those types of terms. I mean, we've certainly heard companies ask questions about HB2, so I think the more important question is what would that resolution ultimately look like with respect to HB2. Certainly that effect has been seen on things like conventions and conferences, sports tournaments with the NCAA and ACC. And then, to some extent with some of the companies that we're dealing with, they've raised that as a concern. Many don't bring it up at all because it's probably not relevant to their decision. But, like anything else, you have a lot of diverse opinions on a subject like this. We've had some companies that say, hey, this might be a factor in what we look at. And so, yeah, I'd say if there ends up being some change in direction on House Bill 2 and that policy, then very well you could see some companies kind of adjusting what their outlook is towards a new investment in North Carolina. What we think could happen is that sort of a Trump administration policy points a lot to import barriers, whether those are tariffs or some other kind of duty that's levied on imports into the U.S. There's a lot of emphasis on Buy America, Made in America. I mean, we all heard what happened with the Carrier factory in Indianapolis. There's certainly talk about dropping out of some of these multilateral trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even maybe renegotiating NAFTA. What those things could mean to us here in North Carolina, look, like I said, the United States is still one of the most attractive markets to sell into. As a customer market, it's still very attractive if you're a company anywhere here in the world. It's because our demographics are still very favorable. We're growing, our economy is growing, our population is growing. Europe, more or less flat. Japan, it's been flat for 20 years. China, very unpredictable. So if the U.S. is still an attractive market to sell into, and all of a sudden you have barriers that make it more expensive for products that are made elsewhere and sold in the United States, we believe that actually could mean more companies outside the U.S. decide to put some sort of footprint or presence in the United States to capitalize on what they continue to see as an attractive market. If that happens, that means more opportunities for us to recruit foreign investment. The day after the election, we instructed our foreign offices in Germany, Japan, and Korea to begin reaching out to the major automotive manufacturers based in those markets. All of those companies by now have a factory in the United States somewhere. But look, if there's going to be new import tariffs raised on luxury vehicles made in Japan or Germany and sold in the United States, that may push some of these companies to decide, let's bulk up our production capacity in the U.S. We know we can still get the sales there, but if we're gonna sell less because of import tariffs, that may be offset by us putting a new factory somewhere in the U.S. And we've been competing with Mexico for automotive plant attraction because of NAFTA. Well, if NAFTA gets renegotiated, then there's no longer much benefit for an auto company to build a factory in Mexico and simply ship those to the United States if there's going to be some sort of an import duty or renegotiation of NAFTA. Bottom line is what I've been telling folks for what it's worth, and I'm just 2 cents worth of opinion here, I think that there's actually some potential for us to attract more foreign direct investment as a country, and then of course that translates into North Carolina having increased opportunities to attract some of that same investment. But we'll see. The time will tell, right? We'll know here in, what, 45 days?
Or tonight. But tweet.
Yeah. Yes, actually, that's a good point. I'd say buy Twitter stock. Other questions? If not, I want to thank CC for having me here with you all this morning. Again, appreciate the support you all give to your local chamber as well as your local EDC. We can't do our jobs at the state level without their partnership. So thanks for having me. Always good to be here in Haywood County, and hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you.